you've been lied to about stereo sub. Keeping your sub mono has been a cardinal rule in production forever, and for good reason, but it falsely implies that there's no good way to make it work, when in reality, if you just understand the reason that stereo sub is bad, you can just make it without those flaws. And in fact, it's not even a new thing. People like Noisia were doing it at least 15 years ago on songs like Diplodocus, and I'm certain that there's even more examples from even more people from even farther back. But before we learn how to make it work, let's first understand what we're trying to avoid. So, as I'm sure you know, stereo means two different channels of audio, one that goes to your left ear and one that goes to your right ear. And it's the difference between those two signals that creates width. It's what creates the perceivedness of depth and motion and being like, oh man, stuff's going all around my head. Or like, oh man, this song is really big. But mono is just one signal, which means your left and right ear are getting the same thing, which means there's no difference, which means there's no perceived anything, and everything's just sounds like it's right here in your head, like right here. Now for basically all sounds, putting an effect that makes something stereo is okay, because the sound literally spans thousands of frequencies. So if the left and right signals cancel out somehow on one frequency, that's fine, because there's literally 1,000 bajillion other ones. And usually it's a part of the effect that you're putting on, that you're trying to get it, and it's fine. Like supersaws, for example, is literally just taking a bunch of phasing and weird stuff to make this big hazy mess that sounds great. And so, nice. But for sub, the fundamental of sub is literally one frequency. And so if you put stereo effects on there, you're just making two slightly different sine waves that usually will interact destructively. AKA they'll cancel out or get all weird and warbly, or it'll just end up a big wobbly mess or sound like a rumble, or just be like, or it'll be, it'll just sound weird. And so that's why generally people say avoid stereo sub, make your sub mono, because you don't want a weird rumbly mess that sounds all rumbly dumbly. Now if you make a really crazy stereo sub, the only problems you'll ever encounter is if it gets collapsed to mono and you get all the weird crazy stuff. And so if you don't really care about any of those, you can just be like, well, I don't care, and then bam, you've done it. But if you do care about those things, stuff such as live venues, their live sound systems, their subs are usually in mono. Sometimes phone audio or other things, or the ways people are listening are in mono. There's a lot of context where audio gets collapsed to mono that you don't really think about, that just kind of happen. And also, it's just kind of a good litmus test of the structural integrity of a song. So generally, I do agree with keeping your sub being able to work in mono. But that doesn't mean it has to be mono. That's the difference. So now, we know what we're trying to avoid. All we're trying to do is make stereo sub that when it's collapsed to mono, remains fully intact. So there's no weird cancellation. It doesn't sound weird or stupid. It just sounds good, but it can still be stereo. And so if you know that, that's all you really need to know, because now you can just be on your journey making weird sounds. And if you're just checking to see if your sub still sounds good in mono, you'll probably stumble across something that sounds good in mono with it being super stereo sub. But now you're probably saying, well, that hasn't taught me how it works, or how to do it intentionally, or how to do it without having to spend 5 years banging my head against the wall making weird sounds until I randomly magically stumble across stereo sub that sounds good in mono. And you would be right. So let's get to the bottom of how to make stereo sub that doesn't destructively collapse to mono. Thing number 1. You need a phase difference between your left and right signals that is less than 1/4 of one cycle of your sub. For example, at E0, one cycle is around 24 milliseconds. So if the difference between your left and right signal is less than 6 milliseconds, then your sub will stay intact when collapsed to mono. However, the more you offset, the quieter the collapsed mono signal will get. And here's a little graph that shows that relationship. Isn't that cool? And so you may be thinking right now, isn't that just Haas delay? Yes. You can Haas delay your subs a little bit, and they'll be okay. And I know it feels wrong, and I don't like it either. And I don't just do Haas delay because it still feels dirty and wrong. Because most stereo sub you'll find in the wild and songs that you like or just stuff that's cool, there's another element to it. So all you technically really need is Haas delay, but the second thing takes it to another level. And what is that second thing? Slightly different waveforms in the left and right ears. What? I mean, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. If you have slightly different waveforms, they'll sound a bit different, and then if they're slightly offset, then oh my gosh, this sub is so stereo. But when you collapse it to mono, it all just comes neatly into one a bit different waveform that's all intact and perfectly good in mono. And so really, these are two pretty easily achievable and simple things. And so you can make a sub like this and then just process it like crazy and make all of your basses out of it. And then you have crazy stereo sub basses that are crazy and stuff. And so yeah, that's it. Those are the two things that you need to make stereo sub that just works. And so let's look at a bunch of examples. Oh my god, I'm in the corner now. Let's look at this project. The first example is just straight up Haas delay, just to show you that it works and so you believe me. So here we have a sine wave with a Haas delay of 6 milliseconds, which is 1/4 of the single cycle. And stereo, it looks like this. You can see the peaks of the sine waves are slightly offset. And when you collapse that down to mono, it's just a sine wave, and it just works. But as you can see, it is quieter. At 6 milliseconds, at a fourth of the cycle, I believe this one's at minus 6.7 compared to minus 4.9, which is, what is that? A 1.8 dB difference. So yeah, it does get quieter in mono, but it is there and intact. The sub is still there. Let's look at some examples from some songs so we can see both things in action and gain some insight. The first song is Orange Festival by Fizz Inc., which let's hear just the size of Orange Festival for a second. So you can hear the sub is like really just in the sides. The bass is just in there. And the same thing with this drop over here. But if we listen to these in mono, the sub's still there, and we listen to the drop in mono, the sub's still there. So what's going on? Well, because I made the song, I can tell you. And here is what all of the basses are made from in that song. It's this thing right here. I'll turn off the EQ. Which is the sound I made by just taking two different waveforms. Each of them is detuned a different amount, and then it's processed a bunch together, and it's all just one long note. At the end of this big long note, is this part. I'll low pass it just for a second. Now, if you listen to this, it's like fully stereo. But also, if you collapse it to mono, the sub is still there. And so if we take a look at those two things, this yellow one is what it looks like in stereo. As you can see, the peaks are a little bit offset. And also the left ear's waveform is a bit different. You have these little doohickeys and little differences between them. And so the waveforms are different, and the left and right ears are slightly offset. The two things we talked about earlier. And so when you collapse it down to mono, you just get this, which is a slightly different waveform than either of them, but it is a consistent waveform that fully works in mono. Now, it is a bit quieter than the stereo version, but that's fine. Now, let's look at the example I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Diplodocus by Noisia. Here is this part of this song. Here it is low passed. If you're listening to that sub, it's so wide. The sub is fully there in the stereo and in the sides. It's crazy. But then when you put it into mono, it's just as there. So let's look at the waveforms. Once again, the yellow one is the stereo. And as you can see, the left and right signals are a bit offset. Here's a dip, here's a dip, here's a peak, here's a peak, 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 value. The right one is a bit later. It's a bit less offset than the previous example, but it's still offset. And more importantly, the waveforms are very different. And by very, I mean in subterms. They don't look that different if you're not like looking at subs a bunch on your computer screen real big. But for subs, this is like pretty big, kind of. And so once again, we see the two things in action. In this example, it's much more leaning towards the waveforms are different. That gives it that stereo-ness. Now here's an example that's just as simple as Haas delay, but even more effective and even cleaner and better in my opinion, which is just distorting a sine wave a little bit, but spreading the bias. And you're like, what does spreading the bias mean? Tobias? My name's not Tobias. But all bias means is actually, I'm going to butcher this. All you need to know is that it's taking distortion, and then there's this thing called bias, which shifts a bit how stuff is distorted, and it's applying slightly different biases to the left and right ear. Difference between left and right makes stereo. Yay! And so if you look at it, look at the waveform of it, you can see that the peak, the little dip here and the dip here are offset, and the peak here and the peak here are offset. But the left ear is a bit ahead on this dip, but the left ear is a bit behind on this peak. So it's not just straight up shifting one ear, it's sort of squishing them both, like doing a little squish, whoop. And then that's what's giving it that stereo-ness. And so the waveforms on the left and right ear are different. Their little peaks and dips are at different spots. And so you get the full stereo spread effect. But when you sum it to mono, you get this, which once again is still a bit quieter than the full stereo signal, but it's pretty freaking sick. And so now with all this information, we can make something ourselves that does both of those things. So what I have right here is this Serum patch. So all I did was look for a wavetable that was almost a sine wave, but had some differences in it. And so on this one, if you just look at this oscillator, there's this part where it has this shape, and if you move it over here, the peak over here moves and the dip over here moves. And so it's you get two a bit different waveforms. All I did was take those two, spread them left and right, low pass it, and then that's all you really need. It's just two different waveforms in the left and right ear that aren't too dissimilar, because when you sum those two to mono, you still get a perfectly just good sub in mono. And if we look at the waveforms, you can see it also clearly. This one's peaking in a different spot than this one. The dips are in a bit different spot. But when you sum them to mono, it all becomes one thing that looks like a very clean waveform. And it's like, yay! But if you wanted, you can go a step further and take this and spread it too. And then it becomes like super. It actually doesn't add that much stereo and just makes the collapse signal a bit quieter. So I wouldn't do it in this case, but you can. But point being, if you either offset the left or right channel a little bit, or have slightly different waveforms than the left and right ear, or do both, you can have stereo sub that fully collapses to mono. And the great thing about that is you don't just have to use that for a separate sub. You can make a long sub render like this, and then process it like you would a sine compression base. If you don't know what that is, I'll make videos on it soon, but there are good resources on YouTube already on how to make those, where you just take a simple waveform, saturate it a crap ton, filter it a crap ton, compress it a crap ton, and then repeat a bajillion times and just do a bunch of whatever you want to get a bunch of cool, crazy sounds. You can make whatever you want out of just sine waves, basically. And this is showing you how to make fully stereo but mono compatible sine waves. And so now you can just make all those bases with things that will have fully stereo sub, and it'll just sound crazy. And you'll get so much cool, fun stuff, but the sub will still work in mono. And so you'll just have these overpowered stereo basses that are just like, whoa, this sounds so big, but it still freaking works, and you can play it live if you want, or have someone else play it live and it'll still sound good. And here's the thing, here's the root of all this. whenever there's a big rule that says, don't do this, or freaking do this, or you have to do this, or don't listen to that. Think about it, figure out why that's a thing, and then think about how you can do that and get around the things that make it bad. You can get around everything. Rules are just things that are generally okay sometimes. And so nothing is absolute. Please just test stuff. If you understand and think about things, you'll find crazy crap, and then you can do crazy crap. And then you'll just have crazy crap, and you'll be doing crazy crap, and it'll just be freaking sick. So here's the thing. Just listen. Just think. Also, I like listening to stuff, but think about things. Think about why people say certain stuff, why there are rules, and then think about how you can go about circumventing them or just doing whatever. Also, most rules are just BS, and you can just ignore them. Do what you want. Lesson number 1, do what you want. Don't listen to anybody but yourself. Make stuff for yourself. Do what you want. It's awesome. But if there are things that are rules of like from a stereo sub, that one feels like, oh, that's an actual engineering thing that I should just listen to that's just right all the time. Wrong. You can get around even the biggest rules. You can do anything. I want you to do anything. Do anything. But yes, thank you so much for watching. If you want to see me make more of these stereo sub one-shot things, and if you want them, the files for them, and also other fun things to do stuff with, those videos are on our Patreon. If there are other things you want videos for, or parts of Fizz songs you want breakdowns for, or just anything at all, tell me in the comments. I'll put it on my big list. If you haven't listened to Fizz, what are you doing? It's right. Go click on go do it. But anyways, I hope you have a great day, or night, or evening, or in between, and have fun.